All right, it's 9:30, so we can go ahead and get started. Welcome to RootsTech, day 2. Everybody having a good time so far? Awesome. I am. I'm just so glad that you guys are all here. I just think it's amazing that there are this many people sitting in dark rooms with no windows when the weather is so beautiful outside. You could be out skiing, but instead you're here learning about your family history, so good for you. My name is Alison Taylor, and my husband Tom and I have a company called Pictures and Stories. And for about the last 15 years, we have helped people put their life stories and their family histories into beautiful coffee table books and videos. And I have the best job in the world. It is just so much fun to be able to hear everybody's stories. So what happens if you give a non-genealogy person a pile of papers that looks like this? Right? Am I right? Yeah, and that's because we get excited about things like this because we're kind of family history freaks, and we know how to interpret what those facts and figures mean on that piece of paper. But a normal Muggle type person, a non-genealogy person, doesn't really know how to process this information, right? And if you hand them a chart like this with numbers on it, they are not going to care because they can't connect with that. So why do we want them to care? Why is it so important for us that these people get our people, our dead people? Because we want them to feel the connection that we feel to our ancestors, right? And they can't feel connected unless they feel something. And they don't know how to feel something just from looking at those dates and places and numbers on a chart. So therefore, it's our job, those of us who love and who are addicted to family history, it's our job, whether we're a beginner or whether we're a professional, to find the human meaning in the data and then to be able to translate that into meaningful human language, okay? The story is in there, it's in the data, but it's our job to extract it and to weave a tale for our reader so that they can feel that connection. Okay, so, and you don't have to do this by writing a novel or writing some huge tome about your ancestors. We can do this in bits and pieces. So, by way of example, I want to start with just writing a really short sketch. You know those little life sketches that you can put in Family Search, right? Now, I looked on the Family Search blog, and they suggest that you only put facts and figures in a life sketch, that you don't use any personal pronouns, and that it should just only be the facts in sentence form, okay? Okay, I think the facts accuracy is also is important, but I think that, you know, any of us can plug these dates into a genealogy program and it'll spit it out in sentence form. Like any computer can do that. But is it anything interesting that anybody would want to read? No, probably not. So, I think that we can take these dates and we can still make them into interesting sentences that might actually engage someone. So I'm starting with this very short sketch on Travis Coe, who is an ancestor of mine. And I've done this sketch with just the information that I can find on Family Search. This is not any heavy-duty research. So let's look at a couple of dates on this chart here. First of all, I see, now, and if you can't read all this, it doesn't really matter. I'll kind of show you what you need to know. We see that Travis was born in 1859 in Ohio, right? Okay. So then we look at his father. His father died in 1864. What does that tell me? That tells me that little Travis was only 5 years old when he lost his father. Okay, that's sad. That's a human thing. We also look and we see that his father died in Nashville, Tennessee. Now, Nashville, Tennessee is a long way from Ohio. So what else was going on in 1864? The Civil War, right? So I think, oh. So I just go into Ancestry, I type him in the search, and this is what comes up. I see this is his father, Cyrus Coe, and I find his volunteer enlistment for the Civil War. He enlists on the 11th of October in 1864, and I also find a death record from the Civil War, and it shows he died on October 27th of 1864. 16 days after he enlisted, he died of acute pneumonia, which it also says in the death record, and was buried in Nashville, Tennessee. So that is a story. There's, that's an amazing thing. And it was just there, really easy to find on Ancestry, just there for the clicking. So again, it's our job to extract the human meaning out of those dates and then translate that into human language, into an actual meaningful paragraph. So here is my paragraph that I wrote about that. When Travis was just 5 years old, his father, Silas Coe, left behind his wife, 8 children, and 2 new grandbabies. Now, how do I know these things? Because it's all right there. It shows his whole family on Family Search. To enlist in the Union Army, he must have worried about leaving Emily alone to tend the farm. But the pull of duty was strong, and his oldest son was already in the fight. 16 days later, Silas died of acute pneumonia in a soldier's camp in Nashville, Tennessee. Okay, so these are my facts, but isn't this more interesting than just looking at the dates on the chart? Right? Travis's mother, Emily Porterfield Coe, had already lost 2 babies. Now she grieved her husband without even a stone to visit, as his body was laid to rest in an unmarked grave 400 miles from home. Now, how do I know that she lost 2 babies? Because I look at the family chart on here and I see those middle 2 children. They both died the same year. One was an infant and the other one was a toddler. And then I see her latest 5 children, and I also know that her son is serving in the war as well, her oldest son. Emily worried about her oldest son, John, who was away fighting in the 36th Regiment, Ohio Volunteer Infantry. See, now I put that genealogical detail in there, and I know that because I found his obituary that says that he served in Company C, the 36th Ohio Regiment. So what did I do? I Googled Company C, 36th Ohio Regiment, and up popped his enlistment, his roster information there. So this is all really easy stuff to find. Travis's older sisters had married and left home. Emily was now a widow, left alone to tend the farm and her 5 youngest children. So just from that little bit of raw data that I was able to find within a few minutes in Family Search, now we have the beginnings of a story, right? We've got war and heartbreak and lost babies and courage of going on, okay? All that human stuff, all that stuff that makes us feel something about these people. And it was already in there. I just had to extract it out and then translate it into human language. If you want to read the rest of the sketch that I wrote about Travis, this is his Family Search ID number. So you can go to Family Search and put in Find by ID, and you can see this life sketch on there. Now, I just limited myself to 1 hour to do this, using only what I already had and what I already knew on Family Search. I want you guys to know that I am not a professional genealogical researcher. I'm good at writing stories, I'm good at designing, but genealogy is not my profession. And so I'm at best an advanced beginner. So all of these things I'm talking about today, if I can do this, anybody in this room can do this. This is not rocket science. If you are a professional researcher or a better researcher than I am, then you will have ways, better ways to do some of these things, but these will still work for you. So if you have a Family Search account, maybe an Ancestry account, and if you know how to Google stuff, it's amazing what you'll be able to find to add to your story. If I can do this, you can do this. Now that I've made Travis's little life sketch more interesting, it's great, but it's not really a story. It's just a little simple sketch. And I wanted to talk about crafting a story. So I decided to write a story about one of my ancestors that I was curious about. And part of her story is also my story. It's how powerful this connection that I've had with this ancestor has been for me and how amazing this journey was. It started with only 2 pieces of evidence and with some curiosity on my part. And I ended up a few months later just like with tears streaming down my face in front of my computer, just feeling overwhelmed with love and joy for this person that I had never met. And I hope that all of you are able to have that kind of experience with one of your ancestors. So I'm just going to be reading a few snippets of this story throughout to show you some principles. If you want to read the whole story, This is her family search ID number. Or you can email me and I'm happy to send it to you as well. So I chose this woman, Ethel Coe. She was my great-grandmother's cousin. So she's not even a direct ancestor of mine. When you're trying to decide who to start with, don't worry about trying to follow some chronological order on your pedigree chart. Just start with someone that you are curious about. It doesn't even have to be a direct line ancestor. She wasn't in my case. Who are you curious about? Who do you wonder about? And start there. Now, the only information I had about this woman, Ethel Coe, was a single photograph and a letter that was written in 1902 from one brother to another brother about their niece, who they have just found out is pregnant out of wedlock in 1902. And I chose this woman because when I was a kid, young teenager probably, my dad, who had all this family history stuff, he was quite a character, he would pull this letter out and show it to people with the picture because he thought it was quite funny because of the Victorian kind of flowery language that they used, and he found it quite humorous. But as a kid, I kind of, I felt really sorry for her, and I always wondered what happened to her. So when I decided to choose and go through this journey, she was the first person that came to my mind. So I started by jotting down all of the genealogy information that I could glean from the letter, which is the only thing I had at this point. And so this is where you want to start with what you know. What can I determine from this letter? And then you want to start putting all this information on a timeline of some sort. A timeline is going to help you keep all this organized. Now, here's a screenshot of my timeline for Ethel. I use something called Trello.com, which is a free program. I love using it. It's kind of like putting stickies up on a wall and you can move them around, but you can also attach documents to it. You can use Excel, you can use Evernote, you can just use sheets of paper, whatever works for you, but you definitely want to have a place that you can keep track of all of your sources. And as you find information, you want to notate where you found that so that you can go back to it. Because trust me, if you find out something and then you can't remember where you found it, it's going to be really hard to go back and find it. So you want to keep track of this. If you're more of an advanced genealogy person, you're going to probably have, a research logs and a research plan and everything, and you've already got that organized. And then get curious. Start asking yourself questions. What could this mean? What do I want to know about this person? Why did they move to Florida? Why did they do this? And just write down those questions. You're going to use those questions as a springboard for some more basic research. And here's another tip I want to give you. This is very valuable for me. If you start writing the story as you go along, you don't have to wait until you get all of your facts in place and you've done all of your research before you start writing. Because the act of writing itself is going to really clarify things in your mind. And it'll show you where the holes are, it'll show you what you don't know, and it will just kind of smooth over your research process, and it will bring up more questions for you to look for the answers to. Now, I start my story about Ethel with a direct quote from this letter from one of her uncles to the other. "Brother Will is in deep trouble." So begins a letter written by Joseph Alexander Coe of Parkersburg, West Virginia, to his older brother John on a bleak February day. The object of the letter and of their brotherly concern, William Coe, is mired in agony and shame over what is perhaps the worst calamity that could befall a respectable father in 1902, a young daughter who is with child and without a husband. So in this first paragraph of my story, I've introduced some of the characters, okay, and I've introduced what's called the inciting incident. Now, the inciting incident is the thing that happens to set off the main conflict or struggle in your story. And we know every good story, if it's actually a story and not just an anecdote, has some kind of struggle or some kind of conflict at its heart, or it's not really a story. You notice that I didn't start this story with Ethel Coe was born in 1881 in Belpre, Ohio, right? Like most genealogy stories seem to start. And neither did Joseph Coe when he wrote this letter. This guy knows how to get his reader's attention, right? So if you start with something dramatic, you start with a hook. You start with something that's going to draw the reader in and get them interested and get them to keep reading because they want to know more. And you can do this by, you can pick something in the middle of the story and start with that, and then you can back up and do a flashback and start back at the beginning again. You don't always have to start at the beginning of your story. Now I'm going to start putting a little bit of description in there. If the reader didn't have this photo to look at, I want them to know what Ethel looks like without even seeing the photograph. A gilt-stamped studio photo of Lula Ethel Coe, taken while she was a prep student at University of Worcester, Ohio, shows an earnest, ordinary face framed by round wire-rimmed glasses and a few wiry curls escaped from an upsweep of hair. Okay, so you want to paint a picture in the reader's mind so that they can imagine it in their own mind. Now, this pose was very unusual for the time period for photography. You notice it's photographed in full profile and it's shot from behind her right shoulder, which shows nothing of the front of her body. Okay? So this kind of sets up the next sentence in my story. I wonder if Ethel already had something to hide by the time the photo was taken, or if the photographer is merely experimenting that day. So you notice already I'm on like the third paragraph of my story, and I've used the word I. I've inserted myself into Ethel's story. Can I do that? Should I do that? So in my opinion, the answer is yes, if you want to. You are the author of the story, and your point of view has value. And there's nothing wrong with a story about your ancestor also being a story about your search for that ancestor, or how that ancestor has intersected with your life in some way. You are the author of this story. So if you want to include that as part of the story, it's perfectly acceptable. And in my opinion, I think it makes it even more interesting for your reader, because likely your readers are going to be people that know you, but that don't know this ancestor. Don't be afraid to have a point of view. You'll notice there are two pictures here of Thomas Jefferson. Now, professional biographers, they insert their own opinions into the story, okay? Every author has their own take on this character, and that's why we see a portrayal of one of him as the villain and the other as the hero, both using the same specs to research from. So radically different, but both acceptable, all right? Somebody like David McCullough has his own opinions about the subjects that he writes about, and he can express those without using personal pronouns because he's David McCullough, he's a genius. I'm not as talented as David McCullough, okay? My style is looser and it's more kind of bloggery, but I'm not trying to win a Pulitzer, I'm just trying to get people interested in Ethel, okay? So it's my style, it's okay, it's what it is. And your style is okay the way it is too. You don't have to be David McCullough to write this. You just want to make sure, I'm not saying that accuracy isn't important, because it is, but you want to make sure that you're clear in your story as to what is fact and what is conjecture or opinion on your part. And it's easy, it's pretty self-explanatory to do that. You use phrases like, it's possible that, we think that, family tradition suggests, those kind of things, or you pose your theory as a question, which you'll see in a minute here. Okay, so I go on with another direct quote from this letter. Will's family are in mourning. Will and Addie are in distress. He is weeping over the sad affair. He feels he did everything in his power for the best training and accomplishment of Ethel. And in the midst of her brightest prospects, she blights her future and crushes her parents and relatives beyond recovery. So I can see now why my dad kind of, found this humorous. But also I think it's important for us to reach back and really try to understand what it was like for them at the time. Okay, so now I'm injecting my rebuttal to Ethel's uncle. Looking at Ethel's portrait, she seems hardly the type to go about carelessly crushing anything, least of all her parents' fondest hopes. So I'm already feeling connected to Ethel, and I'm feeling a little bit protective of her. Now, conjecture is something that you will be doing a lot of as you try to fill in the holes in your ancestors' lives, because we don't have all the facts. There's no way that we can know everything about someone's lives. And so, in order to make it a palatable story, we're going to have to postulate some theories about what we think might have happened. And that's okay to do that. You just have to be clear about it, like I said. No doubt Will and Addie Coe have pinned a lot of expectations on their eldest surviving daughter, their first baby, Bessie Mary, having died just after her first birthday, and held her up as an example to 4 younger siblings. Again, I'm using basic what's on the family search chart that I know about her siblings. Okay, you can see how I'm just taking this and I'm presenting a theory for how they might have felt about this. Now, the letter says that she was sent home from Worcester. Now, I didn't know what Worcester was when I read the letter, so I Googled it, and I found a lot of information about the University of Worcester. It was fairly prestigious, fairly expensive, small liberal arts college in Ohio, and that's actually a picture that I found on Google of the class ahead, the year ahead of her. So Ethel's not in this picture, but it's really close, and it gives a nice idea. There's so many good public domain images that you can use to add to your story that are just out there for the picking. Wikimedia Commons is a great place to go to look for pictures. There are all kinds of historical societies that have huge digitized collections. It's not that difficult to find really great photographs to add to your story. So continuing with the story, they have sacrificed to send Ethel to a prestigious Presbyterian preparatory college, try saying that 3 times fast in a row, 150 miles away from her hometown for that best training and accomplishment. Now, so this background research is going to be really important for you in trying to find enough detail to make your story interesting and to try to solve the mysteries of where that happened. And fortunately, we have a lot of information available. So you want to look for what were things like at that location in that time period, what kind of culture did they do, what did they wear, what did they eat, where did they go to church, what was the family's economic status, what other historical events were going around at the time, like Silas Coe in the Civil War. So those are the kind of things that you can easily find online. So Joseph's letter again defends Ethel's spotless upbringing by his brother. She's been fortified on either side by the best examples of chastity. Not a finger of scorn dare point. A pure stream out of a pure fountain has been polluted forever. Oh, how sad. Polluted forever. That's harsh. So to me, this is the struggle of Ethel's story. Will she really be polluted forever? Or is she going to get through this somehow? That is what I want to know. That is the question that's driving me. So here comes a whole bunch more conjecture. Counting back 9 months from May of 1902, which is when the letter said she was expected to be due, Ethel must have been at her parents' home in the green, tranquil hills of Belpre, Ohio, at summer's end, when she met an itinerant piano tuner by the flamboyant name of Pearl Beebe. It seems that Beebe spent some time in the family's home, having sold a piano to Ethel's father. Okay, so, and I know this from, the father is named in the letter, so they know who the father of the baby was. Now, William Coe, I do a little bit of background research on her parents. He's listed as a farmer on the census records, like, half of the country at that time period. But he considers himself, by some other writings I found, a merchant and investor. So he's like sort of the, the late 1800s entrepreneur, right? And he must have been at least fairly successful because he owned his farm free and clear, and he had enough money to send his daughter to a pretty good school and to buy a piano. So we know he's doing pretty well. Her mother was the daughter of a very well-respected state senator in Ohio. So again, I just want to set up the characters a little bit to see what they're like. And all these things were easily found for me on Family Search. Okay, so now I know that Pearl Beebe is the father of the child because he's mentioned in the letter. And so I don't know much about him, so I look him up too. And I found him in some census records and city directory records in Marietta, Ohio, which is near to the town where she lived. And I used this data that I find to kind of create a human character for him. So here's my description of Pearl Beebe. Meanwhile, 23-year-old Pearl Beebe was evidently enjoying a hapless, tuneful bachelor life in a boarding house in the nearby city of Marietta, Ohio, as a piano tuner and salesman for the Stevens Organ and Piano Company. Okay, so these are just things that I have found out about him from the records. I found a picture of the Stevens Organ and Piano Company building and a picture of Marietta, Ohio around that time period. So these are things that are easily findable that you can add to your story to add interest. So I don't know what happened between Ethel and Pearl Beebe. So I could say, I don't know what happened between them, or I could make it more interesting by making my questions actually a part of the narrative. Did Ethel fall in love with this sweet-talking salesman with a made-up name? Did he walk with Ethel along the river in the moist August moonlight, charm Ethel's father with firm handshakes, and bring bouquets to her mother? Did he whisper marriage to Ethel as a way of lowering her guard? Or were his methods crude and violent from the start? So can you see these pictures in your mind? Instead of just saying, I don't know, these are things that I'm curious about. So I'm sharing my curiosity with the reader to try to get them curious as well. And I'm using my own imagination, and I'm using imagery and emotional language, descriptive language, to make that come alive for the reader. Okay, things like the moist August moonlight. If anybody been to Ohio in August, it's very moist there, right? Bringing bouquets to her mother, whispering marriage. So you use descriptive language. And some of you might feel uncomfortable with this type of expression. And that's okay. You might be more comfortable with a more dispassionate kind of style. But for me, I would rather err on the side of being corny than having it be too dry and boring. So that's kind of up to you. So now I postulate an alternate theory. Okay, I've kind of played devil's advocate with myself in the story. It is possible, of course, that Ethel thought of herself as a thoroughly modern girl, sneaking cigarettes behind the college and rolling her stockings down, and that a fling with Beebe was an act of rebellion against her parents' best examples of chastity and the virtue she was expected to exemplify. But then I go back and look at this picture again. It just seems really unlikely to me, looking at this photograph, that she is that kind of girl. Her looks are modest, and plain girls, unused to male attention, are the easiest of prey for flashy piano salesmen. So, forgive me, Ethel. I love you. So I think that from looking at the events in time period in my backstory research, I think it is very possible, probable even, that Ethel was taken against her will, or at least seduced. I think a young woman from this upstanding, very religious Presbyterian home that's very concerned about their reputation undoubtedly would have been taught about the morals of sex, but probably not much about the mechanics. And I wonder, did she even know what was happening to her? Did she have, she probably didn't know how to defend herself if that happened. So we do know that she didn't see a doctor until she was over 6 months pregnant when she was sent home from school. She was about 20, 21. So doing this kind of historical research is very important, and it's also really, really fun. It's so interesting. So now Joseph mentions in his letter that Ethel's father is going to attempt to prosecute Beebe, but I could find no evidence, no paperwork or anything that he actually did this. So I wanted to look this up and see what would it have been like both for her and for the family in 1902, what was going on in the background. So I find out that in the year 1900, in some Midwestern states, statutory rape was just being considered a misdemeanor. Okay, not a felony, a misdemeanor. And the age of consent had just been raised to 18 from the unbelievable age of 10. years old. All right? So she was like 20, 21. So it was unlikely that any prosecution, had he tried to do that, would have been successful anyway, because it would have been her word against his in 1902, all right? Even though, as the letter says, that apparently it turns out that she is not his first victim, but the third, that there are 2 other women that he has gotten pregnant before. So in the letter it says that Ethel's father had tried to convince Bibi to marry her and was unsuccessful in that. Apparently, it's less embarrassing for the family if your daughter marries a scoundrel who then disappears and takes off than it is to just be an unwed mother. So Bibi skipped town, leaving Ethel unaided to bear both the baby and the disgrace. And I know he skipped town because he completely disappears that same year from all the records in Ohio, and I don't find him anywhere. So he was either run out of town or left on his own accord. And I find him 5 years later as one of the only survivors of this horrific boat accident off the coast of San Francisco. And it killed like 100 people or something on these boats. Now, this is interesting to me, but it's not, it's an interruption to the story of Ethel. And besides, I don't really want to give him any more airtime. So I make him a footnote in history, and I put this information in the footnote in the story. So you're going to find a lot of interesting information that is valuable, but if you try to describe it in your narrative, it's going to interrupt the story. So those are really great things to put in footnotes. Okay, I can find no birth records whatsoever listing Ethel as the mother, and I can't find any children of the right age suddenly appearing in any of the extended family that might have adopted the family. So I have no information about what happened to the baby. I don't know if she had a miscarriage. I don't know if she went away to a woman's home somewhere or to a distant relative and had the baby, then it was adopted away. But I could find no evidence of this child anywhere. So the big question in my mind, someday I'll get to that question, but what I want to know is what happened to Ethel then? What was her experience? And this is what creates the suspense in my story. So you always want to look for moments in your story that what is suspenseful for, what is going to keep the reader wanting to know what happens next. And it's likely what you're also in suspense about as well. So don't be afraid to use your own suspense in the narrative or in your research journey as part of the narrative. The letter ends with, Will says if he had lost every cent he is worth, it would count as nothing in comparison. He says he could get more property, but he has lost that which can never be restored to them, namely the dignity of a pure family and home. If you can lend a word of sympathy and relief, don't fail to do so. It is surely needed at this dark hour. So this is a picture of the Fore brothers. And it's obvious to me that this was a really close family and that they had great love for each other. But my sympathy as author of this story is with Ethel. And so I wonder, how did this affect her future? Did anybody offer words of sympathy and relief to poor Ethel in her darkest hour? So that is my cliffhanger, my research cliffhanger, and it sets up the theme. The theme of your story is going to be the answer to what these questions are. What happens to her? Does her family forgive her? Does it ruin her life, or does she somehow rise above it? So these questions, which won't get answered till the end, set up the theme for the story. Let's talk just for a second about theme. A theme is basically the takeaway of your story. It's the main idea of your story in a word, 1 to 3 words, and it's kind of a universal idea that makes everybody able to relate to it. And these are just some themes for some really popular stories. Harry Potter's classic good versus evil story. Now at this point in Ethel's story, I don't know what the theme is because I don't know what the end of the story is. I don't know what happens to her. So is it going to be a tragedy of the destructiveness of shame, or is it going to be about resilience and overcoming obstacles? I don't know that yet. So I have to do a little bit more research. So I do, and I find an interesting item. 4 years later, I find a marriage announcement in a paper in Virginia about Ethel Coe, who is being married to the well-known and popular Mr. Frank Spencer Holdcroft, who is from Richmond, Virginia. And it says that the couple is being married in the bride's home, the bride's parents' home in Ohio. So I think Good. That is a hopeful sign to me. It means that she still has a relationship with her parents and they're giving her a wedding. So she hasn't been like ostracized from the family forever and she's able to procure a pretty good marriage. But I wonder about this Croft guy. I'm thinking, you know, is he good enough for her? Does he know what she's been through, you know, or did she have to hide that in order to get a respectable marriage? So interesting plot development. And then I find out from census and other records that I find their marriage license application. And although they get married at her parents' home in Ohio, they immediately move to Virginia and they move in with his parents. And they spend the next 30 years there in Richmond, Virginia. They live on and off with his parents and live in kind of some other rental homes and so forth. He has a small savings and loan, and it says on the census that she works as a secretary for most of this time. I don't know anything that says that she still has a relationship with her family, so I wonder, you know, I'm thinking, what is the theme here? Is this going to, I thought, well, maybe it'll be about kind of family love and forgiveness overcoming, you know, that she has this. But now I see she spends 30 years in Virginia. I don't know if she has any contact with her family. So, you know, that theme maybe is in doubt again. Looking at their lives and kind of the scant information I can find by these records, I find out that they never had any children together of their own, which makes me sad. I conclude that their life together was a good enough life, an average, ordinary life. Kind of neither a tragedy or a triumph, which, you know, most of our lives are that way. I'm just here to tell you, don't get too attached to your assumptions, because the more you research, you will find out that you were wrong. Okay, and so what I just did there, that's called foreshadowing. I'll talk about this more in a minute. So I find some other clues, which then bring up a whole new bunch of questions. Now, Ethel's mother dies in 1921, and they've been in Virginia for about 15 years by this time. And Ethel's father, at the age of 71, suddenly shows up in census and directory records in St. Petersburg, Florida. He's been like this, you know, popular businessman. He's been in Ohio his whole life. Why does he suddenly move to Florida? And I still wonder, you know, has he had a relationship or any contact with Ethel this whole time? So he marries a widow there, and he's there for about 10 years, and the widow dies in about 1931. And then I find a little snippet in a newspaper that describes, I love these old-time newspaper gossip columns. You get so much information out of there. He goes on this kind of whirlwind tour visiting all of his children where they live. And I notice in here that Ethel is not included in the children that he visits. And I'm kind of crushed by this. And I'm indignant on her behalf, all right? I'm like, really, dude? You know, why didn't he also go and visit her in Richmond? Well, I was soon to find out. So things like saying, I was soon to find out, that is called foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is where you give the reader a clue that something is about to change, that something else is coming, and that creates the suspense that makes them want to keep reading. And it's even more effective if, instead of giving them the answer right away, you then go back and talk about something else. You kind of reverse, you know, back up a little bit, talk about something else for a few paragraphs or a few pages or even for a few chapters, and then you come back to it. So you kind of keep the reader interested. The cool thing about foreshadowing is that it still works even when we're writing about historical events that people already know how they end, right? You still, as a reader, you know how the war ends, you know whatever, but you still feel that suspense. So it's a cool trick to use in your writing. However, in the interest of time, I don't have time to back up and go, so I'm just going to go forward with the story. And I find out now from this record why Wilco did not go and visit his daughter Ethel on this whirlwind tour, because instead he went to live with her. So here is, I find his death certificate that shows that, and another newspaper clipping that shows that Ethel and her husband Spencer took care of him for probably the last couple of years before he died. And it says on his death certificate that he had senile dementia and that he died of pulmonary edema. So now I'm back to my theme of, family forgiveness. Like, it just touches me that this is how their story ends up, that they end up together as father and daughter. So now I have this touching little conclusion to my story. So this is the last paragraph here. Although Will had 4 other children living at the time of his death, it was Ethel, his first living daughter, perhaps the source of his greatest joy and his greatest sorrow, who held his hand and stroked his brow as he took his last breath. Now, I wasn't there. I don't know that she held his hand, but I can imagine it. And it's okay to imagine that. It's okay for me to put on words on the paper that explain how I imagine it. Whatever struggles their relationship had suffered over the years, it had endured. In the end, the gouges and splinters of early heartbreak and resentments were sanded smooth by duty, forgiveness, and love. So, and this is, again, I'm taking this piece of data, this piece of paper, and I'm putting it into human emotional terms, all right? And I'm pointing out for the reader what this death certificate meant to me. And for me, it was uplifting, and I'm back to my theme of family forgiveness. It feels hopeful to me, and I'm happy about this. And this is where I ended the first draft of this story, and then I put it aside for quite a while. I still don't know what happened to the baby. I don't know what happened in the rest of Ethel's life. There are a lot of things I don't know about Ethel. It's not a complete history of her life. It's just a story about what might have happened. And it's got characters, and it has theories and conjecture, and it has a theme. And it has a beginning and a middle and an end. What I want to tell you is that you don't have to know everything about a person to be able to tell a story or part of their story. And I also want to tell you that go ahead, even if these stories are not complete and you don't have all the data you would like to have, go ahead and post early versions of these stories wherever you can, on Family Search, on blogs, on social media, everywhere you can, even if they are incomplete. Because you never know when someone else out there might have another piece of the puzzle. And you can get help with your research that way. The best thing that could happen with your research is to have a cousin read your story and go, that's not how it happened because I have this other piece of evidence. Great, that's fantastic. So for someone to call you and tell you that you were wrong about this is the best possible news. So I can't leave the story alone. I'm still curious, so I have to keep digging and looking. And I find some odd things. I find out that suddenly in the middle of the Depression, after living in Richmond, Virginia for 15 years, or 30 years rather, they suddenly show up in Macon, Georgia. And he has a really nice government job with a pretty good salary. $3,000 a year in the Depression went a long way. And they live in the chiropractic health home in Virginia. So that brings up a whole bunch of questions, like how did they get there? And then 10 years later, they start showing up in records in St. Petersburg, Florida, where her father had lived, moved to 20 years before, but he's been gone for a long time by this time. So why, what's the connection with Florida? What happened there? So I can't figure this out, so I have to keep digging. And one day, I'm clicking on some things in Family Search or Ancestry, I can't remember which, and I click on something that takes me to the newspapers.com website. Now, this will show you the level of my research skills. I have a paid subscription to newspapers.com that I use to research back history for helping clients with their books. Now, it's never occurred to me that I could go to newspapers.com and actually look for my own ancestors on newspapers.com. So I find the mother lode of information in newspapers about these people. And this is where I have to face up to how arrogant my theory was about how, they just had these average little lives, right? What I found blew me away. I had totally underestimated these people. And I also have a new theme for my story now. I find out that Ethel, who was listed on the census records as a secretary for all that time, that she wasn't just a secretary, because on the census record there's about this much room for them to write your occupation, right? It doesn't really give you the whole story. Just like her father was a farmer, he was a lot more than a farmer. I find out that in Richmond, Ethel continued her education on her own without any help from her parents, and she was trained as a caseworker for the Family Service Society, which was a charitable organization in Richmond, Virginia, that helped children in need, orphans, unwed mothers. You see where I'm going with this? And she is not just a secretary, she is the intercity secretary for the entire organization in the state of Virginia. So this woman could not have children of her own, so she instead forged a career helping other people's children. How awesome is that? And that's the office building where she worked. I also find out quite a bit about the well-known and popular Mr. Croft, who I admit I had my doubts about. I wasn't sure if he was a good guy. All I knew is he had a savings and loan in Virginia. It turns out he was kind of like the George Bailey of Richmond, Virginia, right? And I don't know what happened to his savings and loan during the Depression. Either it went bust or he closed it. But he becomes the finance head of the Richmond Community Fund, which is an umbrella charity organization that organizes all the other little charities during the Depression in the state of Virginia. And he oversaw a staggering number of social welfare projects, everything from farm aid to helping the homeless to food drives and toys for kids. And I mean, it was just, the list was like this long of things that these people were able to accomplish. And he also ran for city council in Virginia on the platform of widows relief. So, and I think that's interesting because his father-in-law had been raised by a war widow. And also I find out that two of Ethel's sisters both lost their husbands quite young. And so they were also widows. These are people who devoted their entire lives to serving other people, particularly needy youth and children. And I'm going, okay, this is not a story about forgiveness anymore. This is a story about redemption and about transformation, taking those hardships and really making something about them to help other people. And here I was thinking they had these sad, kind of average, sad little lives. I also find out why they ended up in Macon, Georgia, right? So Spencer was hired away from Richmond because he'd done so well with the community fund there. He was hired by to become the newly created Director of Public Welfare for Bibb County, Georgia. Okay, now that totally makes sense to me. He'd done really successful things in Virginia, so they hired him away to become the head of this welfare department, and they do all kinds of great things there. I also find out some really cool other little small things about them. I find out that Spencer loved to sing, and that he directed the church choir, and he was always doing these little singing gigs. He also taught a really popular Bible class that was advertised in the newspaper. And I find out that Ethel once played Eleanor Roosevelt in a play that she did for these Baptist churchwomen. And I also find out that Ethel's sister marries Spencer, one of the widowed ones, marries Spencer's brother. And that he raises her small baby who, there's obviously a lot of connection and warmth between the Coe family and the Holdcrofts, and that makes me really excited too. And I also find out why they retired to Florida. So I find a little deed notice that says that in 1941, Ethel's brother deeded her 47 acres in Florida. Now, presumably that was land that he got, that he was given when his father died. And for some reason, he ended up giving it to Ethel. Maybe he thought that she deserved it, and she was the one that took care of him before he died. So we don't know. So Ethel and Spencer spent 5 more years kind of saving the world in Georgia before they finally can retire and move to this home in Florida. And true to form, they don't just sit on the porch and relax. No, they start a fruit grove and they start selling fruit. And Spencer also serves on the Pinellas County Welfare Board, and they keep doing all their many church and civic activities. So these are busy people, even in the retirement. And then just before Christmas in 1947, they are just barely 2 years into their retirement, and Spencer suddenly dies. And I'm just like, oh. So, and then I also find something that gives me Ethel's death date 23 years later. Okay, and I'm dying to know, what was she like as an older woman? What kept her going for 23 years after her husband died? So one day I'm just kind of minding my own business. I'm scrolling through the St. Petersburg Times on newspaper.com, 1953, and I see something that just blows me away. And I start yelling, Tom, 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 you gotta come and see this. And he runs in from the other room, and I am like sobbing into my keyboard because I find my and she's got the same glasses and like almost the same hair, you know? It's just like, and it's a full-page article. Man-sized citrus grove prospers in feminine hands. This is 4 years after Spencer has died, right? And there she is in this full-page article. And reading this article, I find out she's now 72 years old. She has hired new people. She's built new buildings. That's a picture of her. The little picture there is of her laying pipeline, irrigation pipeline in the fruit grove. You know, she's in her 70s. She does all the bookkeeping herself, and she tripled production of the fruit grove in those 4 years after he died. And I can't quite believe this, but the article also says that she walks the 6.5 miles to the grove and back from her home every day. I don't know. That's just beyond. When asked why she does all this in the article, she says, I decided it would be better for me to come out on top rather than let my husband's death get me down. How awesome is that? So this is, this is what I write in response to finding this. I know it's just soft journalism, a Sunday piece of fluff in the women's section of a small town newspaper in 1953. But I am overcome by a wave of joy and pride. To me, she might as well be Joan of Arc or Amelia Earhart. I am in awe of the amazing women in my family's history. I'm grateful for the trails that they smooth before me and for the influence on my life now. I can feel them whispering encouragement, my own personal booster club. So this isn't quite the end of Ethel's story. A few years later, she sells this fruit grove to some developers to create the Croft Heights housing development in a huge real estate boom in St. Petersburg. And she keeps investing that money and makes a fortune in real estate. But she stays living in the same house that she bought with her husband, and she stays there until she dies in 1971. So here's the conclusion to my story of Ethel. When I started my search for Lula Ethel Coe, I had no idea where it would lead. Would Ethel's probable rape and the shame of a resulting pregnancy crush her spirit, damage beyond repair her sanity and her family relationships? Or would she find a way out into the light? Pearl Beebe may have stolen her innocence, but he couldn't touch her virtue. She always was and is yet a pure stream out of a pure fountain, not polluted forever. So you see, I'm bringing this story full circle back to the beginning and reminding the reader of where we started. Ethel Coe Holdcroft not only survived her darkest hour, she killed it. She crushed it into 1,000 points of light. She transformed her worst trial into a pipeline of compassion that fueled a long life of resilience, hard work, and Christian service. And that is Ethel's story. And I'm so happy that she seemed to have a happy ending. However, not all the stories that we find of our ancestors are going to have happy endings. And that's okay too, because the tragic stories are just as important. And we can learn just as much from them. So don't feel like you have to, if it's not a positive story, that you can't write about it. And I still don't know what happened to the baby. So that's my next job. All right. I've got about 4 minutes left. I've got a really quick wrap up if you want to snap these slides. This is all in your syllabus as well. But try starting to write the story as you go along while you're doing your research. I promise you that will really help you. Remember that their story is also your story. You don't have to stay out of it. Find the human meaning and translate that into human language. Pick a subject, whoever you're curious about, write what you know, write your questions, put them on a timeline and keep track of your sources. Background research, start with a hook, show, don't tell. Use those details to create the story. Use conjecture and use questions as narrative. Use your imagination. Footnote any facts that interrupt the story. Find a theme. create suspense, use foreshadowing, and bring the story full circle. I just want to say you can do this and you should do this, and I hope that all of you have an experience that I had with this amazing story in Finding Ethel. Just do a story, even if it's a short sketch, and publish it somewhere. Don't wait until you have all the facts to be able to publish it. Just put it on a family blog, or use it as a springboard to write a full-on historical novel. But whatever you do, do something. So thank you for being here today, for your time.